Hello everyone, it's the Pace Chaser again. Welcome to another video. This is an introduction to a 5-part series I've done walking the route of the Great Central Railway's London extension, also known as the Great Central Main Line or the last main line, within the city of Nottingham from Bulwell in the north down to the River Trent just south of the city centre. I do mention in the past that I'd already done the introduction, but I've redone it. I wasn't particularly happy with the original one, so I'm doing this after I've done the 5-part series. There is also a correction video. I made a mistake in the final part of the series, which I realised after I'd finished doing it. So I've also done a correction video. I'll put the links to all of the videos in the description to this one, and also put all the links in the descriptions to the videos themselves, so you can get to any other part from the part you're watching, basically. The links will become live as the videos become live. I've uploaded them already, but they're scheduled as I'm doing this for a staggered release. So there'll be some on one day, some on another day, etc. So all the links will become live once all the videos become live as well. So the purpose of the introduction is to do a brief history of the route, to explain why there's not much of it left, because if you're familiar with the route you'll realise that there aren't many remains. You will see all that in the walks, and we do find what is still there, but there's not an awful lot to say. It was quite a heavily engineered route, and we'll explain why it was so comprehensively demolished after it closed, and I'll talk a little bit about the actual series itself. So back in the 19th century, there was a railway company called the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway, or MSLR for short. As the name suggests, it ran from Manchester to Sheffield and on into Lincolnshire, specifically to Grimsby and later to Cleethorpes. Over the years it built various branch lines, including one down from Sheffield to Annesley. In the early 1890s, the MSLR announced it was going to build an extension to London from Annesley. Now, generally speaking, if a relatively unknown provincial railway company said it was going to London, people would just start laughing. But the chairman of the MSLR at the time was Sir Edward Watkin, and if Sir Edward Watkin said he was going to London, then he was going to London. Construction began in 1895 and the route opened in 1899. Shortly before it opened, the MSLR changed the name to the Great Central Railway to better reflect the enlarged operating area, and I'll refer to it as the Great Central from now onwards just for ease and convenience. The Great Central were quite late to the party. The other routes from the north and the Midlands to London were already established, the ones we now know as the East Coast Main Line, the West Coast Main Line and the Midland Main Line. So they had to do something different in order to compete, and they decided to try and be faster. So the route was built for high-speed running. There were no sharp curves, there were no steep gradients, and there were no level crossings. And all that meant a long series of earthworks and structures. There were massive embankments, lofty viaducts, deep cuttings and long tunnels. London wasn't actually the endgame for the Great Central's London extension. It was supposed to be part of a route to the Channel Tunnel that they were going to build. And yes, Sir Edward Watkin did start building a Channel Tunnel as well. He got 2,000 yards out from the British coast before the government stopped construction. They ordered him to halt. They were terrified that France would mount a hostile invasion through the tunnel. So, as I said, they ordered the work to stop. The working still exists. Indeed, the modern day Channel Tunnel cuts across them at an angle of about 45 degrees. There is a short bit just off the coast where the sides of the tunnel are steel plates, and that's blocking off the access to the Victorian tunnel. But anyway, back to the Great Central's London extension. One of the first obstacles that they faced on the way south from Annesley was Nottingham. The earlier railway builders, when they arrived about 50 or so years before, had found a relatively small market town that was easily negotiated. However, the Great Central found a developed industrial town about to become a city. It got city status in 1897. All the obvious routes through Nottingham had been taken by other railways, by roads and by canals, so the Great Central had to roll its sleeves up, take a deep breath and just smash straight through, and that's exactly what it did. Entering the city at Bulwell in the north, it passed over a massive viaduct. It went through a series of junctions that featured underpasses and flyovers, the kind of things that we expect on a modern day motorway junction. And it alternated between a series of high embankments and deep cuttings, went through 3 tunnels, a massive cutting in which was Victoria Station, and eventually finished its passage through the city by going over an enormous bridge over the River Trent. The route closed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it's been fairly comprehensively demolished. The reason for that is Nottingham City Council were worried about it falling into disrepair. They were terrified that bricks would begin to drop off the bridges and viaducts and fall onto people below, that local kids would play on the bridges and viaducts and fall off and hurt themselves, or come to grief in the tunnels, and they were also concerned about antisocial behaviour, which, believe it or not, was still a thing back then. So in the 70s, they bought more or less all the route through the city of Nottingham, and as the 70s and 80s wore on, they began to redevelop it. Obviously, buying it gave them the liability for maintenance and security, in other words, like fencing off the viaducts and things like that, and from repairing the fences when people broke through them. And that was poor value for the ratepayers of Nottingham. So what the City Council did was they began to demolish the route, and that removed the liability for maintenance and also for security. When they'd finished demolishing it, they had a swathe of land through the city that could be redeveloped, so they sold it off to developers, and in doing so made money for the council and reduced the rates for the ratepayers of Nottingham. So the bridges and viaducts were demolished, the embankments were demolished, and the spoil from them used to fill the cuttings in. And as I said, a whole lot was sold off and redeveloped. The bits of land that had been embankment and had been at ground level were sold more or less straight away. The ex-cuttings were allowed a few years to settle before they were sold off. Now, a lot of people say that they should have protected the alignment of the railway in case it was needed in the future, but there's no way that they could have known back in the 70s and 80s the kind of resurgence there would be in the rail industry. It was widely believed that the existing rail network at the time would continue to contract, that fewer and fewer people would use it and more lines would close, and it would get smaller and smaller till eventually we're just left with the main intercity routes. Nobody could see a future for railway lines, and so if you'd mentioned that you wanted to keep one in case it needed to reopen, people would just have laughed at you, basically. So what Nottingham City Council did at the time, it made sense for the time the decision was taken. And as I say, they couldn't have foreseen the fact that the route would ever be perhaps needed in the future. A lot of enthusiasts think that Nottingham City Council was anti-public transport, but the reverse is true. They were doing things like workplace parking charges, where the money went back into public transport, bus lanes, park and ride, restricting access to the city centre. They were doing all that back in the early to mid-70s, before such things were even thought of in most places. A lot of it fell by the wayside over the years because opposition parties weren't as keen, but they were quite pro-public transport. As I said, they just couldn't have foreseen the need for this railway line, or any particular reason to keep it. So that is a quick history and a quick rundown as to why it was demolished as comprehensively as it was. So as I say, there's 5 parts in the series. In the first bit I go from Bulwell at the site of Bulwell Viaducts down to just south of the station at Bulwell Common. The second bit I take a detour from the route to see part of a footbridge that used to be on the Great Central but was moved when the line was demolished, but still exists on a different site to this day. In part 3 I pick up where I left off on part 1, just south of the site of Bulwell Common Station, and I carry on to the site of New Basford Station and the northern portal of Sherwood Rise Tunnel. In part 4 we look at the site of Carrington Station. That's quite a quick bit, as is part 2. There's not much left at Carrington. And in part 5 we set off from the site of Victoria Station in the city centre that we're looking at now on a postcard view, down to the River Trent, where the line crossed the River Trent, and that's where we finish it. I did make a mistake in part 5. I'll explain that more fully in the correction video that I do to it. But basically I thought that the main lines ran on one side of the goods offices and the goods lines ran on the other, and it's not the case. They all ran on the same side of it. So where I thought the main lines were was wrong. I also wrongly thought that Nottingham Midland Station was already there in its current form when the Great Central built theirs, their Victoria Station, but it wasn't. It was actually rebuilt after the Great Central opened, in answer really to the Great Central. You can see Victoria Station, as I say, on this postcard view, and you can see how grand it was, and the Midland wanted to improve their station so it looked as grand, basically. But yeah, that's it. As I say, I'll put the links to all the different parts of the series into the description to this one. But thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.